Welcome. Thank you all for coming out on such an inclement day. We appreciate it, and there's a treat in store for you. Our speaker tonight is Peter Berkowitz, who is a former director of policy planning at the US State Department, so he has some real-world experience of both politics and geopolitics. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and I should mention also that he and I met first some 30 years ago, I think. At that time, it was still possible for old-fashioned liberals to meet in American universities in conditions other than secrecy. And, might be a bit harder now, but we talked then at Yale and at other places and at conferences where old-fashioned liberal opinions weren't the source of immediate condemnation, and so forth. And so I'm very glad to meet him again after all those years. Tonight, he's been a practicing political theorist during all those years too. And tonight he's going to talk about the Declaration of Independence, whose upcoming anniversary, 250th, I think, is in 2026, and about rights, but above all about liberalism. What's alive in it, what's dead in it, what it means. So please join me in thanking and greeting Peter Berkowitz tonight.
Thank you.
I should say that after his lecture, he and I will be in conversation for about 20 or 30 minutes.
Good evening. I also want to thank you for coming out on this rainy evening. I want to thank Dan Robinson and the Pharos Foundation for providing a wonderful opportunity to spend a week at Oxford. I also want to add that John and I did meet several decades ago. And since my days as a young graduate student, I have been reading John's books, admiring John's books, enjoying John's books, and learning from John's books. So it's a special honor for me to be here and soon in conversation with John. As John mentioned, this talk tonight comes out of an assignment I was given in the United States to prepare a long essay for a volume to mark the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And as John suggested, marking that great occasion provides an opportunity, the necessity of reflecting on, to borrow a title of a talk that John's given, what's living and dead in liberalism. Although these days I actually prefer to refer to the modern tradition of freedom. It's a less loaded word, and it captures the truth that ideas about freedom come to us embedded in a tradition full of continuities and discontinuities. All right. The United States Declaration of Independence and the nation that it brought into existence in July 1776 changed the course of democracy in the West. Before the Declaration and the birth of the United States, democracy generally had a bad name. It was considered an unstable regime, prone to descent into democracy and dictatorship. After the American founding, democracy came to be associated with the basic requirements of political justice, at least in the West. Crucial to the transformation of democracy's reputation was the distinctive alliance that the Declaration forged between democracy and the defining conviction of the modern tradition of freedom. The defining conviction of the modern tradition of freedom, that defining conviction is that human beings are by nature free and equal. The defining conviction. The alliance gave birth to the regime known as liberal democracy. Today, we so much take this alliance for granted in America that we typically refer to our regime as democracy simple, without modification or qualification. This is a simplification, however, and this simplification gives rise to confusions between the protection of what the Declaration calls unalienable rights, the rights inherent in all human beings, and the rule of the majority. The use of the term democracy, when liberal democracy is meant, also cloaks the advantages to democracy of its alliance with unalienable rights. Again, unalienable rights is an 18th century term for, to simplify a bit, for natural rights, for the rights that all human beings share. Over nearly 2.5 centuries, constitutional government in America has been tempered, stabilized, and elevated by the convictions about unalienable rights that gave birth to the nation. These convictions, however, do not belong to democracy's original and core meaning, these convictions about rights. Today, as the United States confronts alarming levels of discord, division, and dysfunction, it's instructive to reconsider the nation's formal founding principles. It's also useful to examine influential misconceptions propounded by intellectuals about the moral and political implications of America's founding principles. And it's helpful to explore seminal lessons, some ancient, some modern, about democracy and freedom, about how to sustain democracy and freedom. A better understanding of the assumptions, ideas, and aims that spurred the transformation of 13 British colonies into the world's freest, most prosperous, and most diverse great power has practical benefits. It contributes, or at least I hope it will contribute, to the restoration of that unity in diversity that remains, as it was at the founding, America's founding, essential to advancing the public interest. Study of the Declaration forms a core component, then, especially in America, of liberal education. And liberal education is that distinctive form of civic education that is central to preserving and improving liberal democracy in America. What I'm about to say may, for some of you, appear introductory, but these days such introductories, at least for most American audiences, are indispensable. The liberal in liberal democracy derives from a Latin word for free, does not refer to the political left in liberal democracy, but rather to the modern tradition of freedom. That tradition antedates the contemporary distinction between left and right. Actually, that tradition has largely determined the issues over which left and right in America have contended. The modern tradition of freedom, again, rests on the conviction that notwithstanding the countless differences among human beings, all are equal in one crucial respect in regard to basic rights. This tradition affirms that the chief task of politics is to secure those rights. This tradition is wide and deep enough to encompass thinkers including John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Adam Smith, Edmund Burke, Alexis de Tocqueville, John Stuart Mill, Friedrich Hayek, Raymond Aron, only to mention some of the most notable. This tradition captures opinions held in common by most Americans throughout most of the nation's history. And by the way, of late, as John alluded to, the modern tradition of freedom has been targeted by critics on both the right and the left as the principal source of the nation's ills. I'll have something to say about the conservative and the progressive critique of the modern tradition of freedom. Okay, whereas the liberal in liberal democracy identifies a moral standard and states the major purpose of politics, the democracy in liberal democracy denotes the ultimate source of power in the regime. Of course, the root meaning of democracy is rule by the people. However, the people does not alone refer to every human being or even every human being that lives under the laws of the city or state. The people means the collectivity of citizens. But who forms this collectivity? Typically, the people equate their rule with the rule of the majority. Giving expression to majority will, the people can make wise laws or foolish laws, and they can govern cruelly or decently. The people can hold slaves, exclude women, establish state religion, punish impiety, censor speech, and ostracize citizens without trial, as in Athens. Or they can leave faith to individuals, guarantee free speech, prohibit expulsion with or without trial, as in the United States. The people, if it's just democracy, pure and simple, can provide generously through the laws for the poor, the sick, the elderly, the young, and all those who are unable to care for themselves, or they can leave those responsibilities to citizens in their private capacity. The majority can rule directly by, say, gathering in the town hall, or they can submit political questions to referendum on the internet, or they can rule indirectly by delegating authority to representatives. And representatives can be chosen in a variety of ways by drawing lots. This reflects the egalitarian belief in equal competence. Representatives can be selected through elections. This, by the way, although don't tell this to political science departments, elections actually reflect an aristocratic belief that citizens can and should pick the best among themselves. And if they so desire, the people can establish a liberal democracy. This is a rights-protecting democracy grounded in individual freedom and human equality. A liberal democracy that emphasizes the importance of civic virtue to the preservation of political liberty is also called a republic, although not all republics affirm that human beings are by nature free and equal. This is what distinguishes a liberal democracy. A few remarks about what the Declaration of Independence calls self-evident truths. Actually, the Declaration has a wonderful formulation there. It says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, injecting a kind of faith to the notion of self-evidence, not simply self-evident, but held by us to be so. As Abraham Lincoln observed in the middle of the 19th century, with the Declaration of Independence, the United States became the first nation anywhere to establish itself based on the moral principle of natural freedom and equality. Hadn't been done before. The idea in the Declaration's words, I quote now, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's how the Declaration puts it. Government's chief purpose, states the Declaration, is to secure these universal rights, which are said to be inseparable from our humanity. How do we secure rights in the American context? To accomplish that purpose, citizens must construct a variety of political institutions, and they will need to enact and enforce a variety of positive laws and positive rights, that is, laws and rights that are not inherent in human beings, but which, tailored to varied and changing circumstances, safeguard citizens' universal rights. These self-evident truths about politics stem from the convergence in the United States of several distinctive traditions. Here I touch on a common mistake promulgated by professors. We're, especially in our field, political theory, we're asked to choose sides, sign up. Are you a rights guy or a woman, a virtue guy, a virtue woman, a community virtue, a virtue theorist, a rights theorist, a communitarian, proponent of identity politics, whatever? It is thought to be hopelessly simple-minded to believe that to give a proper account of politics, one must give proper due to rights, virtue, community, identity, civil society, and more. In any case, so far I've spoken about the modern tradition of freedom. That is indeed one of the traditions that forged the American tradition. One could speak more broadly, and appropriately so here, of America's British heritage, stretching back to the 1215 Magna Carta, embracing the common law, the writings of John Locke, the 1889 Bill of Rights. All this oriented Americans' political thinking around rights and the need to limit government power. But there are other traditions at work. America's biblical tradition, teaching that all human beings are created in God's image, impelled Americans to provide in a language accessible to all human beings an account of what citizens were owed by government and others in virtue of their humanity. And America's civic republican heritage, deriving from classical Rome and stressing the responsibilities of citizenship, connected for America's founding generation the enjoyment of freedom to the readiness of a public-spirited citizenry to defend it. Again, it's wrong to suppose that we have to decide which is the defining tradition, the civic republican, the religious tradition, the modern tradition of freedom. Each made an essential contribution. Without one, we wouldn't have what we recognize as the United States of America. Now, the Declaration identifies the laws, I quote, the laws of nature and of nature's God as the source of its universal moral principles. But the Declaration refrains from pressing the argument, and it refrains from pressing the argument not only because the Declaration is a practical political document, not a doctoral dissertation or an essay for a professional journal. Intended to unite Americans and to explain the justice of their break with Britain to other nations and peoples and themselves, the Declaration does not offer theoretical justifications in support of its grandest philosophical and theological claims. By insisting that the truths on which the nation was founded were self-evident to us, held by us to be self-evident, the Declaration actually shifts attention away from philosophy and theology to the reality of widespread beliefs in individual freedom and equality, widespread belief in individual freedom and human equality among Americans. And who are these Americans? They were British colonists who were taking the momentous step of separating their nation from one of the world's great powers. Now, it's well known the Declaration of Independence never mentions the term democracy. It would be hopelessly superficial, though, to conclude from that it is not a document that affirms democracy. Because the Declaration affirms as self-evident the core democratic idea that the people rule, that all just power derives from the consent of the governed. At the same time, the Declaration says nothing about the structure of government, leaving it to the people to determine, in view of their particular customs, traditions, specific circumstances, and the exercise of their practical judgment, the institutional arrangements, political and civil rights, and laws best suited to securing their unalienable rights. The people needn't be directly involved in every government decision, but all exercises of government power need to be ultimately traceable to the people's consent. The democratic principle of rule of the people converges with the principles of modern freedom in the conviction that free and equal individuals can only incur an obligation to obey law by consenting to it. My obligation to obey stems from my consent. The modern notion of consent has precursors in the biblical idea of covenant and classical ideas of political obligation. The basic idea is that constraints on freedom are chosen well when they enhance freedom. The modern tradition of freedom emphasizes that consent may be not only expressed, but also, and for the most part, is tacit. By living within a political order that secures individual rights, including the crucial right to leave, and benefiting from the law's protection, one signals one's acceptance of laws to which one has not expressly consented. Thus, by the way, contrary to a common canard, this suggests that the social contract tradition, far from being radical, is fairly conservative, if consent is based upon living under established laws and benefiting from those established laws. Still, we can ask, and we should ask, how effectively does the theory of consent translate into practice? Does it not overlook that our habits, our beliefs about right and wrong, and our moral and political judgments derive not from considered choice alone or even primarily from it, but from cultural inheritance, unwritten but widely shared norms, long-standing institutions, and common practices? What of those who lack the opportunity to consent forthrightly and explicitly to their nation's founding? That is, most people most of the time. And whether in a self-sufficient city or in a continent-spanning nation-state, why should one who takes consent seriously obey disagreeable laws or those downright contrary to the public interest? Again, the answer here will be tacit consent. To the extent that you are overall benefiting from the system, you owe allegiance. Excuse me. But again, why laws with which one disagrees? Why do they not justify disobedience? The tradition's answer goes something like this. The consent that matters for the purposes of political obligation is not to this or that law, but to the constitutional framework for making, executing, and adjudicating laws. The consent that the modern tradition of freedom places at the center of political legitimacy is the agreement to comply with all the laws, the bad ones as well as the good ones, that emerge from the lawful operations of the constitutional process. At the same time, consent is not a blank check. Within the boundaries of the constitutional framework, citizens can oppose laws through criticism, peaceful protest, and not least through building majorities to adjust institutions, enact better laws, and implement just reforms. Consent, moreover, is limited by the purpose for which it is granted, which is the protection of basic rights and fundamental freedoms. This is a lesson that we in America need to be reminded of, especially these days, because of lots of reckless discourse I'm happy to discuss with John. But foolish government action and ill-conceived laws do not nullify consent. Impairment of rights through short-sighted legislation, clumsy or sluggish execution, or flawed judicial reasoning, all these do not release those who live under the laws from the obligation to obey. Rather, consent is dissolved by government's massive, systematic, and irreversible onslaught on citizens' basic rights and fundamental freedoms. When government destroys the very conditions for securing basic rights and fundamental freedoms, it is also self-evident, according to the declarations, is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Such a right, says the Declaration, following Chapter 19 of Locke's second treatise, will seldom be exercised. Declaration says, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. Very close to Locke's own language. But seldom is not never. Sometimes transgressions are, by the government, are unbearable and irreversible. In those circumstances, states the Declaration, the people must take momentous steps. Again, more language taken from the second treatise, chapter 19, when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Tyrannical government dissolves the grounds for consenting to state authority. That, in a nutshell, is the political theory of the Declaration of Independence. It is a more than tolerably good. It's an excellent summary in about 2 paragraphs of the political theory of laid out in Locke's second treatise. I don't for a moment claim, I've already suggested that that's not the whole of the American political tradition, but it is at the center of the Declaration. These days, intellectuals are promulgating misconceptions connected to the Declaration's self-evident truths quite aggressively, and I want to discuss three of them. One of the misconceptions is disdainful of the modern tradition of freedom. It maintains that universal rights and consent are a disastrous scam. A second misconception diminishes the scope of majority decision-making in the name of democracy. A third misconception, also in the name of democracy, enlarges and emboldens expressions of the popular will to the detriment of basic rights and fundamental freedoms. All three of these misconceptions erode the balance of democracy and freedom woven into the Declaration in America's constitutional tradition. All right, let's call that first misconception the disdain and dismiss strategy. It comes in right-wing and left-wing variants these days. According to the right-wing version, the Declaration, like the entire modern tradition of freedom, is based on a false and pernicious understanding of human nature and reason. Rights, it is asserted, are an imaginary construct. Universal claims are a mirage, and consent has no stopping point. The modern understanding of freedom, conservative critics allege, impels human beings to seek emancipation from all limitations and to inevitably lose themselves in greedy, heedless, and debasing pursuits. The self-destructive illusions built into the Declaration's principles, conservative critics contend, blind those who live under their sway to perennial truths about politics and society. That, for example, that is, if you are subject to the delusions of the Declaration of Independence, somehow you can't recognize that men and women are social beings, that custom and tradition mold opinions about justice and happiness, and promote the cultivation of virtue and sustain community and family. You also can't recognize that a well-lived life requires dedication to the common good, supposedly if you take the Declaration seriously. The left-wing version of the disdain and dismiss strategy. It agrees with the right-wing version that rights are a false and pernicious invention and that universal claims are a mirage. But instead of seeing the Declaration's principles as a vehicle for the chimerical quest for total freedom, progressive critics view these principles as mechanisms for perpetuating racism, sexism, and sweeping inequalities of power, wealth, and status. They have a hard time explaining why it is that by any objective measure, racism, sexism, and sweeping inequalities of power, wealth, and status have been steadily diminished in the United States since its founding, which is not to say problems, great challenges don't still exist. Okay, that from the right and the left is the disdain and dismiss strategy. The second misconception about the principles of the Declaration, or you could say, principles of classical liberalism. You might call it the Rousseauian gambit. The Rousseauian gambit. It receives classical expression, Rousseau's account in the social contract of the general will. By the way, it also receives its the classic expose of it appears in Isaiah Berlin's great essay, Two Conceptions of Liberty. But this gambit has been enthusiastically employed over the last several decades by progressive professors of political theory and law. It actually radicalizes the idea of tacit consent by ascribing democratic supremacy to laws and public policy that intellectuals have determined to be in the people's best interest. What is democratic is what the intellectuals determine is in the people's best interest. Often the laws and public policy that intellectuals determine to be in the people's best interest conflict with the majority's expressed preferences. However, the professors purport to discern through a variety of thought experiments designed to model moral and political reason, an original position, an ideal speech situation, an imagined colloquy of reasonable people. The professors perform these experiments and purport to derive the laws and policy to which people would agree if they had been properly educated, the laws and policy to which they would agree if their judgment had not been corrupted by upbringing and social environment, by selfishness and greed, by ignorance and superstition, by class interest and bigotry. The Rousseauian gambit, as Berlin, he didn't call it this, but as he observed decades ago, the Rousseauian gambit accomplishes a breathtaking inversion. In the people's name and for democracy's sake, supposedly, it shifts democratic legitimacy from choices made in the voting booth by actual majorities to choices made by professors in faculty seminars, scholar studies, and academic journals. The third misconception arising out of and about the Declaration's principles exhibits what we might call the refounding fallacy. The refounding fallacy. This has become especially popular in the United States in the last few years. Energized by the supposition that if one founding is good, and it was back in the 18th century, then many foundings must be wonderful. The refounding fallacy attributes to every generation the right and responsibility to refound the nation. It finds support in the Declaration's affirmation of the people's right and responsibility to replace tyrannical government with new government that to them shall seem most likely, this is a quote, to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. But proponents of the refounding fallacy, to every generation is granted the right to refound, they fail to take seriously the high bar established by the Declaration, an absolute despotism, the language of the Declaration, that destroys the very conditions for exercising basic rights and fundamental freedoms. The presumption that in every era the people must reconsider not only the basic form of government, but also the character of social relations and institutions, also conflicts with the Declaration's teaching that foundings should be rare and exceptional events. The founding fallacy spawns additional confusions. It blurs the Declaration's crucial distinction between the enduring constitutional framework to which consent is given, often tacitly, and to ordinary law and policy making. It erodes commitment to and gratitude for the nation's formal establishment in 1776. It truncates perspective by directing attention away from the study of America's founding principles and constitutional traditions. By the way, this doctrine is taught now in America's high schools, urging 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds to participate in the refounding of America. It incentivizes short-term thinking by encouraging far-reaching change based on fleeting passions and interests. And it weakens civic cohesion by insisting that the nation is perpetually in need of revolutionary transformation. Exhausting. These three misconceptions, the disdain and dismiss strategy, the Rousseauian gambit, and the refounding fallacy, also blur the role that the Declaration has played as a historical matter in inspiring those who have, across the generations, undertaken pivotal reform of the nation. Time and again, eminent reformers in American history have advanced the cause of individual freedom and equality under law by drawing on the Declaration's principles and demanding that the nation live up to them. The clash between America's founding principles and the realities of American politics has been decided repeatedly in favor of America's founding principles. Even as the institutionalization of slavery and the constitutional protection given to it betrayed the Declaration's affirmation of unalienable rights, that affirmation of rights inherent in all human beings issued a devastating indictment of slavery. The nation violated the promise of unalienable rights in many other ways: the exclusion of women from voting at the founding, the brutal treatment of Native Americans, the post-Civil War perpetuation of racial discrimination through Jim Crow, and other forms of discrimination based on race, ethnicity, and sex and gender. That's all real. But American history records the story of the steady expunging from the law of state-sanctioned violations of equal rights. Many founders, prominently including slave owner Thomas Jefferson, acknowledged from the beginning a searing contradiction between the affirmation of unalienable rights and the horrible reality of state-sanctioned treatment of human beings as property. Jefferson wrote, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever." He also wrote, quote, "Commerce between master and slave is despotism. Notwithstanding, nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate that these people are to be free." Reformers throughout American history demanded freedom for those deprived of it, and they did so by appealing to the unalienable rights in which the Declaration grounded American self-government. For example, in 1848 at Seneca Falls, Elizabeth Cady Stanton adapted Jefferson's phraseology very closely to argue in the Declaration of Sentiments that women deserve the full panoply of rights promised by the Declaration of Independence. She didn't demand new and additional rights. She didn't demand something called women's rights. She demanded rights promised to everybody for women. In 1852, freed slave Frederick Douglass in What to the Slave is the 4th of July, his great oratory. And in 1854, his former colleague, abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, in No Compromise with the Evil Slavery, both invoke the Declaration to demand the end to slavery and the full emancipation of black men and women. They didn't argue for a replacement of the document. They demanded that the nation live up to its principles. In 1863, in his address at Gettysburg, President Lincoln called on the nation, based on the Declaration's principles, to midwife, quote, a new birth of freedom. In 1941, echoing the Declaration's language, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt insisted in his Great for Freedom speech that in domestic affairs the United States was committed to equal human rights, and in foreign affairs to the rights of nations that stem from those rights. And in 1963, from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, Martin Luther King Jr. proclaimed in his I Have a Dream speech that ending racial discrimination requires a renewed dedication to the nation's founding principles inscribed in the Declaration and institutionalized in the Constitution. One could go further and elaborate more. But now I want to switch focus. The basic principles of freedom and democracy do not supply all the inspiration, all the guidance, and all the judgment that yield responsible self-government in a free society. It's often treated as a decisive criticism of the modern tradition of freedom, that it does not, or the American Declaration and Constitution, landmark documents in that tradition, that they don't specify all the beliefs, practices, and institutions that foster virtue and prepare citizens to achieve happiness. That's true, but they provide us with the freedom to undertake the study of those questions, to appreciate the traditions, to incorporate them into our way of life, or to preserve them within our way of life. The history of political philosophy is rich with lessons pertinent to the well-being of liberal democracy in America, lessons that may have not been elaborated or elaborated with greatest depth and precision by people within the modern tradition of freedom, but nevertheless highly pertinent to it, from which we who live within that tradition can learn. Some of these lessons derive from classical thinkers whose explorations of democracy preceded the advent of the modern tradition of freedom's conviction that human beings are by nature free and equal. Some of these lessons spring from modern thinkers for whom the minimally adequate form of democracy, is one that protects basic rights and fundamental freedoms. I've distilled 6 lessons. They're not the only ones relevant to grappling with the perturbations and dislocations that roil America today and other liberal democracies, nor are these 6 thinkers the only ones who provide to us vital insights. But I do believe they offer salient lessons at this difficult moment, and not only for liberal democracy in the United States, but liberal democracy around the world, which is particularly troubled at this moment. Thucydides furnishes the first lesson. Democracy, that lesson can be summarized. Democracy's achievements are bound up with a common inheritance that shapes citizens' character and unites the people. In the Peloponnesian War, the Greek historian traces the defeat of democratic Athens by autocratic Sparta in their 27-year military conflict. He traces it to the logic of geopolitics, to Athenian hubris, unpredictable natural disasters, and the virtues of Spartan autocracy. Early in his account, Thucydides presents a funeral oration delivered by the Athenian statesman Pericles. Emphasizing the virtues that set Athens apart, Pericles salutes, but does not dwell on, preceding generations' courage in preserving the city's freedom and acquiring Athens' empire and passing on to subsequent generations. Nor does Pericles, despite the military context, linger on the present generation's military virtue. Rather, he elaborates the leading features of the Athenian regime and the most resplendent of the citizens' non-military virtues. Favoring the many over the few, Athenian democracy regards all citizens as free and equal. All citizens, not all human beings, while also respecting and awarding merit rewarding merit. From fear of disgrace, Athenians obey the unwritten moral code as well as the written. The city opens its doors to foreigners, and instead of the harsh discipline central to Spartan education, it relies on the good habits born of leisure. It instills the higher virtues while checking their associated vices. Pericles states, "We cultivate refinement without extravagance and knowledge without effeminacy. Ordinary citizens are fair judges of public matters, while, quote, in our enterprises we present the singular spectacle of daring and deliberation, each carried to its highest point, and both united in the same persons, daring and deliberation. Although with the rest of mankind, decision is the fruit of ignorance, hesitation, of reflection." Notwithstanding Pericles' idealized picture of Athens, intended to fortify the people's resolve at a moment of grief and uncertainty, the larger point stands. Democratic citizens' security, prosperity, and flourishing rests on quality of minds and character, rooted in a shared way of life that itself is not produced by, but rather undergirds the people's rule. Plato provides the second lesson. Democracy encourages vices that destroy the people's rule. In books 8 and 9 of the Republic, Socrates examines the decline of regimes, from the best in which philosophers rule to tyranny, the worst. Although admirable for the diversity of human types to which it is home, Socrates ranks democracy as the second worst, giving birth to tyranny. Democracy is marked in his account by the sweet freedom to do as one pleases. It treats citizens as equals, regardless of their virtues. The regime leaves each to gratify every passing desire, as if all desires were of the same moral worth. Democracy empowers the multitude to act on its preference for flatterers over noble and courageous statesmen. And democracy upends traditional authority and erodes customary restraints. Fathers behave childishly and sons strut proudly. Teachers fawn on students and students mock teachers. In general, adults ingratiate themselves with the young, while the young take on grown-up airs. Rules governing relations between the sexes grow slack. Averse to authority of any sort, democratic citizens eventually shrug off the laws, written and unwritten. Could sound familiar? This extreme of freedom, maintains Socrates, ineluctably produces the extreme of slavery, which is tyranny. In the name of equality, the poor multitude expropriate and redistribute the property of the rich few. Since the rich do not readily acquiesce, the people rally behind the strongest and most ruthless man, one who promises to use the most effective measures, prominently including violence, imprisonment, and worse, to make the city truly equal. This, however, results in a radical form of inequality as the people's champion concludes that he must continually accumulate power and property to protect himself from those who resent his strength and ruthlessness. One does not have to accept every particular of Plato's account, Socrates' account of democracy's inevitable descent into tyranny to grasp the destabilizing vices fostered by democracy, and which it does so by eroding the distinction between freedom and license and encouraging the treatment of all wants, needs, and desires as equal. Aristotle supplies the third lesson, really in light of the Platonic critique. To continue to enjoy the benefits of democracy and to contain its flaws, democracy must be combined with other just, if partial and incomplete, claims to rule. In practice, Aristotle argues in Book 4, Chapter 11 of the Politics, democracy amounts to rule of the largest segment of the people. The largest segment of the political order, that's the people, and they tend to be the less well-off. Democracy, or the rule of the less well-off in practice, should be merged, Aristotle teaches, with oligarchy, or rule of the few. They tend to be better off. This produces a mixed regime. Aristotle calls it polity. He contends that this mix of democracy and oligarchy is the best we can reasonably hope for. Mixing of claims to rule for Aristotle is not merely a matter of expediency. That's because both the well-off few and the less well-off many exhibit characteristic virtues and distinctive vices. Owing to their larger accumulations of property, members of the well-off few have a greater stake in the political community. The acquisition of wealth and leisure that wealth brings allow for the development of skills and knowledge essential to production, commerce, finance, diplomacy, and lawmaking. Meanwhile, those belonging to the less well-off, many draw on a substantially greater fund of perception and experience. Pooling their resources, the less well-off, many demonstrate in a variety of cases more reliable judgment, you might call it common sense, than do the well-off few. At the same time, for both the few and the many, Aristotle argues, typical vices accompany the typical virtues. Owing to their lives of luxury, the well-off few, Aristotle says, tend to become arrogant and base on a grand scale, developing an aversion to being ruled and knowing only how to rule like masters. Meanwhile, the less well-off many, disposed to be malicious and base in petty ways, cannot rule effectively because of their neediness, while knowing only how to be ruled like slaves. Harsh assessments, true. The implication, says Aristotle, is the city is best off when it incorporates into the mix a substantial middle class, which is disposed to develop the virtues of the few and the many, while tempering the vices of both. We move now to the modern world for 3 more lessons. James Madison, principal architect of the Constitution, principal author of the Federalist, the authoritative exposition of the Constitution, 4th President of the United States. His lesson: a rights-protecting democracy must counteract democracy's characteristic ailments, but it must do so with measures that are consistent with the principles of liberal democracy. That is, the consent of the people and basic rights. In the famous Federalist 10, Madison focuses on factions. Those are groups of citizens motivated by passions or interests contrary to the rights of individuals and groups, or otherwise at odds with the broader public interest. History and theoretical reflection alike teach that, this is Madison's language, a pure democracy, what I was talking about at the beginning, one in which the people rule directly and unlimited by any other moral principle or political claim, including the truth that human beings are by nature free and equal. Such a democracy produces but can't provide a remedy for factions. Quote, a common passion or interest will in almost every case be felt by a majority of the whole. A communication and concert result from the form of government itself, and there is nothing to check the inducements to sacrifice the weaker party or an obnoxious individual, Madison writes. Hence it is, writing in the 18th century, late in the 18th century, hence it is that such democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Close quote. So what's the solution to the problem of democracy? As I've already indicated, it's already embedded in the Declaration of Independence. independence. The solution is not for government to tightly regulate action or impose uniformity of opinion. Those expedients destroy the very individual freedom that liberal democracy is established to protect. Instead, the people must create political institutions that respect the principles of freedom while cooling the people's judgment, fostering deliberation, and incentivizing compromise. I won't elaborate now. I'll simply say that two of those institutions that Madison does discuss in Federalist number 10 are the institution of representation through elections in which we aspire to find the best among us to rule, and the institution of extending the republic. Before the 18th century, it was widely believed that democracy could only exist in a small polity, a city-state. And Madison says just the opposite. Self-government will only exist in a stable way in an extended, a continental scale regime, because in such a regime, there will be many different interests, many different factions, and those factions will compete with one another and prevent any one faction from becoming dominant and invading rights and subverting the public interest. Fifth lesson comes from Alexis de Tocqueville, probably the greatest student ever of America. Political freedom offers a vital counterweight to the vices spawned by democracy. Freedom offers a vital counterweight to the vices spawned by democracy, not least because of the opportunities that freedom provides to exercise self-government outside of formal political institutions. In the Introduction to Democracy in America, Tocqueville argued that democracy is not merely rule of the people. It is also a form of life defined by an equality of conditions that permeates both politics and society. In politics, democracy, argues Tocqueville, gives a certain direction to the public spirit, a certain turn to the laws, new maxims to those who govern, and particular habits to the governed. Within society, democracy creates opinions, gives birth to sentiments, suggests usages, and modifies everything it does not produce. While affirming democracy's justice, greater and greater equality of conditions, Tocqueville also sought to reduce its costs, consistent with the Thucydidean, Platonic, Aristotelian, Madisonian understanding that democracy tends to produce vices. The democratic spirit, Tocqueville recognized, loosens morals, dissolves bonds of friendship, family, and citizenship, steers attention from human greatness and transcendent goals to mundane activities and material goods. This narrowing of imagination, lowering of standards, and impoverishment of aspirations disposes individuals to obedience to a tutelary government. Such, Tocqueville's phrase now, gentle despotism, close quote, ensures security and comfort. Tocqueville found a remedy to democracy's deleterious tendencies in civil society. What's civil society? That wide space between the individual and the state, which is made possible by a limited government, where much and often the best parts of life are lived. One example from Tocqueville. By separating church and state, Tocqueville argued, the U.S. Constitution empowered religious faith in America to restrain the impulses and the imagination to which democracy gives free rein. The art of association was also critical, he thought, to Americans' ability to rise above the tendencies that democracy encouraged. Through the public-spirited virtues it fostered, participating in the life of civil society, Americans' proclivity to associate, argued Tocqueville, staved off individualism, a malady to which democracy disposed citizens. Individualism did not involve egoism, but rather the retreat from civic duties into a small circle of friends and family. The problem, of course, was not with friends and family, In particular, family provided the essential moral education in America, argued Tocqueville. The problem was with family as a replacement for civic engagement, for neglecting our civic responsibilities. All in all, Tocqueville teaches, liberty under law gives citizens within civil society opportunities to cultivate moral virtues and skills of citizenship that provide remedies to democracy's disadvantage. And here we are in the UK, so the sixth distinctive lesson comes from John Stuart Mill. It's this: democracies grounded in respect for individual freedom require a robust conservative party and a robust progressive party. In On Liberty, Mill connects the need for a party of the right and a party of the left to the case for free speech. Our interest in free speech, he argues, stems from our interest in the truth. In moral and political matters, there is almost always something to be said on the other side of the question. Even wrong opinions either contain a neglected but important element of truth or offer a valuable provocation, the encounter with which strengthens appreciation of the true opinion. In practice, this is now Mill speaking, unless opinions, and by the way, ask yourselves, how many intellectuals, how many professors, how many students, I'll say in America, could affirm what Mill says here? Unless opinions favorable to democracy and to aristocracy, to property and to equality, to cooperation and to competition, to luxury and to abstinence, to sociology and to individuality, to liberty and to discipline, and all the other standing antagonisms of practical life, unless they're all expressed with equal freedom and enforced and defended with equal talent and energy, there is no chance of both elements obtaining their due. One scale is sure to go up and the other down. Owing to human fallibility, not least our propensity to confuse partial truths and congenial falsehoods with the last word on hard questions, owing to this human fallibility, liberty of thought and discussion is essential. Milligan. Truth in the great practical concerns of life is so much a question of the reconciling and combining of opposites that very few of minds sufficiently capacious and impartial to make the adjustment with an approach to correctness. And it has to be made by the rough process of a struggle between combatants fighting under hostile banners. Mill goes so far as to argue that on the toughest and most important questions of morality and politics, society has an urgent interest in ensuring toleration of and a thorough hearing for the minority opinion. These lessons of free and democratic self-government do not yield concrete measures to address the burning issues of the day, but they highlight crucial factors to consider in designing laws, fashioning policies, implementing government decisions, exercising discretion, and adjudicating controversies, all in ways that are most likely to advance the public interest in a liberal democracy. In closing, a word about education, which has been an underlying theme. Speak about the United States now. This may have implications elsewhere. But in the United States, at least, we must revisit the lessons that I've been exploring, which again, some of you may regard as hopelessly introductory. I can only say that while they are introductory, it is very necessary in the United States to revisit them. And we need to grapple with the leading misconceptions about freedom and democracy because of the failures of civic education in America. An astonishing percentage of Americans lack basic knowledge about the assumptions, operations, and achievements of American constitutional government. And by the way, the higher they rise in the educational system, the more likely are students to encounter historically illiterate depictions of America as a uniquely unjust political society. Few colleges and universities these days make a priority of ensuring that their undergraduate students acquire an appreciation of America's founding principles and the key historical moments in the development of the American constitutional tradition. This is in part, I'm sorry to report, because few professors remain in the academy whose training and inclinations enable them to teach the subject. The proper aim of civic education in a liberal democracy is to form citizens fit for free and democratic self-government. That means that civic education in America is not some subset of education. Civic education is liberal education, or liberal education is civic education. What are the implications? Briefly, liberal education in America should prominently feature the study of the principles of politics and economics, jurisprudence, diplomacy, and national defense. Because of their centrality to the nation's security and prosperity, and because of their centrality to the human experience. Liberal education in America should explore America's inheritance, not least its biblical and classical inheritance, because these traditions have nourished and shaped liberal democracy in America. Liberal education in America should teach the painful facts about racism in the United States and the history of other forms of bigotry and injustice, while at the same time examining the political heroism of the men and women who drove reform by calling the nation to honor its promise to secure for all its citizens the rights human beings share. Liberal education should consider alternative forms of government in other civilizations, the better to put America's accomplishments and transgressions in perspective. And liberal education should feature prominently the study of literature, history, philosophy, and theology, because this study refines our understanding and invigorates our imaginations. It does this by illuminating the fundamentals of human nature and the endless complexities of the human condition. Rightly understood and responsibly undertaken, liberal education in America not only transmits vital knowledge, it also fosters the virtues of freedom. How does it do this? Because of its liberal education, it can't help but cultivate toleration of diverse independence and cultivate a richness of imagination and independence of thought and moderation of judgment and appreciation of the many ways to be human and to serve the public interest, and gratitude for the freedom and prosperity to which all Americans are heir. Such an education, liberal education, honors the nation's founding principles and sustains liberal democracy in America. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that extremely rich and complex, but also very clear exploration of a tradition which I think you will have persuaded everyone, I hope, and including me, that is much more capacious, much more internally pluralistic, but not necessarily contradictory, as many of its critics suppose. And you talked about 6 major thinkers and the lessons we should take from each, from Aristotle to Mill, but you identified 3 major criticisms that are made of this modern tradition of liberty or liberalism, constitutional democracy, by scholars, or at least by professors. I have to say I was reminded at a moment when you were talking about that of the only real contribution to political thought of the Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, not generally seen as a favorable figure among people like ourselves, but he did invent the term pedantocracy. And he associated Marx's writings and the political project of Marxism with rule by, not by philosophers, kings, but by professors. We're not that far from that now, except that on contrary to Bakunin, it seems to have come from within as a result of a kind of perversion or development of liberalism, not of communism, actually. But that's the first, a large part of your argument, which refers to the ways in which the modern tradition of freedom has been caricatured and its internal complexities diminished and reduced So the first of the three main things is that rights are basically just a scam, that they just cover over and rationalize a structure of power, which happened to exist in a particular place. The second was that what you called Rousseau's gambit, analyzed by Isaiah Berlin, among others, in which a general will or some hidden collective decision is, so to speak, imputed to the people, rather than discovered in the people by having practical representation. So this is what they want, really, and we'll give them what they want, whether or not they express themselves in that way through the representative process. And the third, which I thought was the most, in some ways, to me, the most intriguing and fascinating, was the refounding fallacy, which is that constitutional orders, liberal orders, can be refounded by each generation, an idea that would have horrified Burke. But of course, the modern pedantocracy goes further than that, and they're refounded every seminar, or at least every seminar series, or perhaps more acutely, by every CV. I then had my own questions, which I hope are directly relevant to your concerns and to your lecture tonight, which are really three. One is, you started by pointing to the part of the Declaration of Independence, which includes the expression, a very interesting expression, as you pointed out, held to be self-evident. And you said that interjected, which I think are absolutely right, a kind of element of faith into the foundations of the modern tradition of freedom. My question here is there a necessary connection with theology, or just a contingent one? That's to say, I'm not saying that, you could put it a different way. Can one hold to this modern tradition of freedom without some kind of theistic commitments of thought that are existing in Christianity or Judaism? I don't mean that those commitments are non-rational. They might be rational if you're a Thomist or even John Locke, who was thought to be rational. It's a question of can the element of theological faith or commitment be separated logically or practically or from each other? If there isn't this element of faith, is there not then an issue in modern societies or late modern societies where there is no cohesive faith in the society anymore? How can they renew themselves as liberal democracies if there isn't anymore? That's my first question. And the second, they're quite short. The second is about democracy and rights. And I thought you brought out very well that rights and democracy, understood within this modern tradition of freedom, aren't dichotomies. They aren't polarities. They, understood correctly, they can reinforce and support each other. But of course, I guess one problem which I have, which is the second question, is if the scope of rights proliferates and is extended far beyond what it was originally intended to be in the modern tradition of freedom, and thereby needs to be limited, you have actually an interesting problem arises, which is that the struggle to reinstall these rights is a very political struggle. Simply appealing back to them and saying, well, they did, in earlier generations or in earlier Supreme Court judges, they didn't assume all this. They weren't extended that far. Doesn't do it because they're enforced as rights, as they are now regarded. Too many of them, inflated rights, often conflicting with each other, and so on and so forth. How do you actually get back to a more limited conception of rights in a practical way? And I guess this comes down to, this could be expressed in a slightly different way by saying, once you have a rights tradition in practice which is very extensive, judicial institutions themselves become objects of political capture.
Yes.
So actually the politics that goes on within the courts. They're taken over. I well remember back in the 1980s when the late and in many ways brilliant Professor Ronald Dworkin used to lecture here. he seemed to me, at least, always to assume that the Supreme Court judges would be liberal, left liberals. When I suggested in about 1984 that that might not always be the case, there was a general gasp of disbelief among the burgeoning pedantocracy that this could be possible. It was a natural truth. I mean, it hadn't always been true in America, of course, but far from it. But it was assumed it would always be. But it isn't now, partly because Trump and there's been a shift with deliberate political capture of the. And finally, that leads to my final question, which is connected with your overall theme, which is the recreation or reinvention or recovery, you might say, of liberalism. Might it not be actually harder to recover liberalism than to create it in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
Because to found it might not a real refounding. I mean, it's necessarily harder because when you have a situation in which large parts of our lives, which under an older type of liberal order, were non-political. That was the point of it. Once you had your rights, there might be an obligation, a Tocquevillian requirement almost to have some interest in public affairs, but you needn't. All your professional and personal life wasn't penetrated by politics. To get back to that seems to require the most intense political commitment against extremely powerful political forces who will not only within government, within the state, but within charities, within museums, within university institutions. You're locked in a kind of battle with them. And worst of all, and I've emphasized this, the politics then becomes the toxic politics of friends and enemies. Whereas in Tocqueville and in even Aristotle, I suppose, going back that far, politics was supposed to be not just a conversation, as Michael Oakeshott would say, but it was supposed to be an exchange between people who regarded themselves as, in some sense, part of the same community. But if it becomes ubiquitous in society, and all institutions have been politicized, and B, if that's the politics of friends and enemies, which was theorized, probably some of you know, by the Nazi theorist Carl Schmitt, who, by the way, was expelled by the Nazis for not being Nazi enough. I think he was Nazi enough, actually, but more than enough. He thought that there was this tendency in modern societies to for politics, which used to be some sort of shared dialogue or conversation, or at least project, to become friends and enemies. So I guess the basic question is, do you share my concerns, Peter, that it's actually once you've got this far in the degeneration of liberal, it's jolly difficult to turn it around again. I'm not saying it's impossible.
Yes, yes.
But it's jolly difficult because the things that were the virtues of the system, which was large parts of our lives, were not political, have been politicized, and therefore to get rid of that politicization, you've got to actually find a political struggle to defeat the people who are trying to do it, trying to continue this.
The first thing that I want to say is, just as I expected, incisive and exceptionally challenging question. So thank you very much, John. And maybe I'll start with the third question first, because it implicates the first two.
Yes.
Yes, we have. I think we do have a distinctive challenge today, and maybe in some respects a tougher challenge than was faced in the late 17th century in England, or the late late 17th century or late 18th century in America. How so? Locke was not inventing a tradition out of whole cloth. He was giving expression to, reminded us 100 years later, a tradition of freedom that had been developing for 100 years, and Locke gave theoretical expression to it. The Americans, in drafting the Declaration of Independence and writing their Constitution, were also giving expression to political institutions they inherited, to a way of life in which the idea that human beings are by nature free and equal, part of shared beliefs. Today, those shared beliefs are under assault in a way in which they actually weren't in the 17th century, and they weren't in the 18th century in America. There was a great debate in America in the 18th century. What's the better way to vindicate our rights? Staying with the king in parliament or going it alone? There was a great debate in the United States in the next decade about the American Constitution between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. But they both agreed that the purpose of government was to secure individual rights. The Anti-Federalists said, this document won't do it. It's going to lead to a renewed form of dictatorship. Whereas today, as I began to describe, and young people here who are studying these matters know, the very notion of rights is under assault from right and left. So yes, today, the defense of this modern tradition of freedom actually involves acts of recovery. That was not so in the 17th and 18th centuries. And if I may say so, though, it also just suggests that conservatives today face unique challenges, so much so that their fundamental actions might not even be rightly called conservative. What do I mean? When the father of modern conservatism published his reflections on the revolution in France, he understood himself to be writing in defense of a basically healthy society. Families were operating as families should operate. Religion was operating as religion should operate. King and Parliament were, there were differences of opinion, but they were largely operating. They should operate. Civil society was operating as it should operate. The little platoon was real. What we don't need, said Edmund Burke, was those fancy, frivolous, indeed poisonous ideas from across the channel. The common man, it was actually, Burke was, people say today in the United States, oh, the union of populism and conservatism, this is an unprecedented development. Nonsense. Burke is defending the ordinary man, the good sense of the untutored Englishman whose morals were just fine. Thank you. In America, at least, I'll restrict my observations to the United States. To be a conservative is to think that America is disordered, deeply disordered, suffering from grave dysfunctions. That means no less than someone devoted to the principles of the modern tradition of freedom, those best principles. A conservative today in the United States is in important respects a restorationist. Yes, he or she turns to the past, but it's in restricted sense preserving what we have inherited. It's in a larger sense reclaiming it against the tides of the present. So in answer to the third question, yes, distinctive challenges in some senses greater, certainly not the challenges that Locke in the 18th century, 17th century, Madison in the 18th century, for that matter, Burke in the 18th century faced, not the same political challenges, which doesn't mean that we don't have much to learn from them. We do. It's part of these acts of recovery and to some extent restoration. Go back to the first question. Yes, it's there are these two elements concerning the fundamental claims in the Declaration of Independence, the self-evident truths. On the one hand, the Declaration identifies the sources. Nature or nature's God. The philosophers among you will want to know, okay, which is it? And how could it be both? And does nature's God differ from the biblical God? Excellent questions. Again, the Declaration was a political document. By then suggesting that we hold these truths to self-evident, I did say faith, I do mean to implicate faith, but I also should have said it's a kind of appeal to tradition. Here in America, in the 18th century, with the war with the Brits, already underway for a year. Here's Jefferson and the other signers of the Declaration of Independence saying, look around you, look within you. We all really know human beings are by nature free and equal. Not asking you to prove it. We're not asking for a dissertation. Look at how you live. Look at the political institutions we have. These are the principles that animate these political institutions. Now, you might say, and your question implied this, but those traditions themselves were vigorous. They were all encompassing. We lack both the faith and those traditions. I'm not entirely sure that we lack those traditions in the United States. I still believe that appeals can be made to the vast majority of Americans on the basis of the claim that when you get right down to it, human beings are by nature free and equal, and that we need laws, we need public policy, we need a foreign policy that reflects this principle. There are many people, intellectuals on both the right and the left, who would be appalled by this assertion, whether it's the proponents of identity politics and intersectionality and diversity, equity, inclusion on the left, or the NatCons and the common good conservatives on the right. But in conversation, in serious conversation, it's still very difficult for Americans to deny this principle. And so that gives me some hope. And so you can say that's, in that sense, I suppose you could say it's a Burkean argument. There's still this tradition, it's confused in people's minds. And I love it, the pedantocracy is making matters worse every day. But still, I suspect a substantial majority. Rights. As you remarked, there is an observable, I'm going to use a phrase I borrow from a great lady named Mary Ann Glendon, a longtime professor of law at Harvard Law School, a proliferation of rights certainly within liberal democracy in America. I imagine here as well. How did that happen? Well, in the first place, in a liberal democracy, we're inclined to speak in terms of rights. We're inclined to lose the distinction between those fundamental rights that all human beings share and civil and political rights, the ones we fashion in order to implement the universal ones. Also, and this must be appreciated, there is a political interest in succeeding in having your political preference recharacterized as a right. Why? You can debate political preferences or something that depends on practical judgment. You're for reducing taxes, I'm for raising taxes, or vice versa. Okay. I've got my empirical arguments why the one serves freedom and equality. You've got arguments why it serves freedom and equality. But the moment one of us succeeds in recharacterizing a policy position, or let me take, instead of taxes, divisive social issues in the United States, abortion, affirmative action, same-sex marriage. Once you get your side of the debate recharacterized as a right, well, a right, that's universal, that's objective, that's necessary. And he or she who disagrees with you, well, that person's unreasonable, immoral, so on. So we have an interest in recharacterizing differences of political judgment, difference of political position or political preferences as rights. That's a bad development. It's a pernicious development. How can it be combated? First, an observation. It is an observation about persuading other people. It's terrible for democracy. It promotes divisiveness. By characterizing political judgments, political preferences as rights, we effectively take them out of the political debate, right? We don't debate, we don't put up for political judgment universal truths. and people who challenge them we regard as evil or incompetent or insane. So the proliferation of rights increasingly narrows political discourse, while it increasingly intensifies polarization and division. Because the more political preferences are characterized rights, the more we're on warring and irreconcilable sides. We can have a debate about policy preferences. You give some, I give some. But you don't compromise on rights. So one, we need to recognize that. And two, I suppose here, this is a difference between Locke's time, Burke's time, and Mill's time. In a way, at a time of substantial deterioration of liberal education, I'm calling for an even greater dependence on liberal education.
Mm.
We need to re-educate ourselves for the liberal tradition. Now, what about those who argue to the contrary? They never invoke Nietzsche, but of course it was Nietzsche who says, what's toppling should be pushed over. The post-liberals, the common good conservatives, which is really, they present themselves as new, but when I was a young graduate student reading John Gray on liberalism, I was also reading Alistair MacIntyre, who in the early 1980s, in After Virtue, was telling us that our form of civilization had decayed beyond repair. There's nothing we could do but prepare for a new dark ages. That book had a big impact on me, but I came to the conclusion that to protect the very things that MacIntyre wanted to protect, the virtues, a life in accordance with faith, decency, justice, it was a better bet to do what was available to us to support, in the United States, the American constitutional tradition, which after all, this in a way is a reply to MacIntyre from all those years ago, but also a reply to people like Patrick Deneen. What after all was the original American conception? The original American conception assumed tremendous diversity. It's true it was the diversity of Protestant sects, but in history, at the time, that was considerable diversity, and envisaged a form of national political life that gave the greatest possible liberty to individuals and their distinctive communities. It seems to me in a modern, highly industrialized, post-industrial society, the best chance we all have to live good and decent lives in a world in which we are fated to live with people who are going to disagree about what is very highest, is to at least agree that decent governments protect basic rights, and is essential to the realization of that hope. I'll stop there, John.
I think that tells us all we need to know about a response to some of the questions that Peter has proposed. Not the end of the conversation, but the start of the way to think about them, I think. And they're very, very rich, and responds also to my question as well. I guess it's a kind of faith in this sense means a reasonable wager.
Yes.
The best bet. And I'm pretty sure it is the best bet. I'm not sure we're that good gamblers anymore, but still. Thank you so much for this not only wide-ranging, but extremely deep and probing exploration of the modern tradition of freedom and how it contains within itself enough, or more than enough, to answer the criticisms you've described from the right and the left. Thanks very much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you all.